to discussing a little bit more about Panama Papers. Played one of my flutes that's made from the Hungarian major scale in E. Gives it a little more of that international flavor that we're taking on in this particular book. I want to talk to you a little about two of the schemes that are covered by Obermeyer and Obermeyer. First one is the murder mystery that occurs in China, okay, and it concerns the politician from Xilai and the death mysteriously of one of his business partners, a British businessman by the name of Phil Haywood, who turns up, dead, and after the autopsy is done, they say he was drunk, and as a result he had, an accident. But it turns out, the guy was not a drinker. In reality, what happened is Xilai's wife, Kailai, had actually poisoned him, and that set into motion a series of investigations where it was finally illustrated that the two worked in collusion to kill Haywood. Now, what does that have to do with the shell companies and the global shadow banking system? Well, here's a situation where they owned a company called Russell Properties, which was, a place where they basically held money, and some of that money, in this case, had come from a billionaire in China by the name of Xu Ming, who gave $3.2 million as a bribe to Xilai and Kailai, of course, to procure certain kinds of political favors. That money then is used to buy a French villa in the south of France, and it's bought through Russell Properties, and in particular a shell company that is associated with Russell Properties called the Résidence Fontaine Saint-Georges, right? Who's the company? It's a totally fictitious shell company that's held in Cyprus, I believe. Buys this, and basically through the money that Xu Ming and others have paid to Xilai as bribes. Well, Phil Haywood, recognized that this was going on, and actually was, very much involved with it, and he was going to blow the whistle on Xilai, that he was doing these kinds of things, because even though politicians in China don't have to reveal the expenditures they make, most other Chinese citizens, if they go abroad, they have a ceiling of $50,000 that they can spend. Certainly very far short of the amount that it would take to buy the villa in the south of France. So as a result, Xilai has to use this, shell company in order to essentially move money outside of China. If you're not familiar with this, you can certainly read about that. Most Chinese citizens are not permitted to move money outside of China. That's why it's particularly attractive for people who are at the upper echelon of China, in order to hide their money, in order to be able to move it outside of China, that they use the global banking system. So if you want to think about it in terms of positioning, the money comes in through bribes, through Xu Ming, all right, and it's positioned in this shell company, in this case the Résidence Fontaine Saint-Georges, which is then given cover because it's part of Russell Properties, which then relates back to Xilai, who's the actual holder of the wealth. And then through that company, they buy, and this is where the integration part comes, legitimate properties like this villa in the south of France. And you'll see this oftentimes is the case for a lot of these shell companies, that one of the things they particularly like to do is to buy foreign real estate. In fact, if you start to dig around, you'll find out that a lot of times when you see property being bought in, say, something like San Francisco or New York City, two very favorite cities in the United States to buy property by foreign, businessmen, that what happens is because they don't care how much money they pay for properties in these particular cities, because it's all ill-gotten gains anyways, and they're trying to legitimize their money. So they'll pay exorbitant amounts, more than most Americans would, for the same kind of property. And this is what leads to real estate in places like San Francisco and New York to becoming so exorbitant, as they become harbors for foreign capital that has been used through corruptions, bribes, then to become legitimized by buying legitimate real estate in the United States. The result is we all suffer. For those people who live in San Francisco, who see rents go up and up and up and up, and real estate continues to be speculated up and up, a lot of that is due to foreign investors who come in and will pay anything because they can, and because they're trying to basically launder money through this process. Okay, so that's something you might want to look for in your particular story. Do you find that when it's integrated, this money is being laundered in a way that they've taken illegal money and they're made it more palatable, more legal? Okay, so that's the story of Bo Xilai and the murder mystery in China. The other one that I want to talk about is the story of Petro Poroshenko and Ukraine, the chocolate king. Now, Poroshenko is a politician. These are both about politicians, and a lot of the stories are about politicians in the book. Poroshenko was the prime minister of Ukraine, where there's traditionally been a lot of, underhanded stuff that has gone on in political history. I was going to look this up and I forgot, but the Trump's campaign manager in 2016, who eventually went to prison, was somebody who was involved in the Yanukovych victory, and then later on in the Yushchenko victory. He was their campaign manager too. So a lot of the quote-unquote dirty tricks that were developed in Ukraine, often, they came back to, the same people were involved in the American election. But that campaign manager, whose name escapes me right now, is in jail. I have a huge article, a great article about that person on the webpage for Panama Papers that you can go and take a look at. And that will be useful for you, perhaps, to look at stories about how Ukraine and other places have been affected by the shadow banking system. Anyways, Ukraine has a long history of kind of sordid players in politics. First, Viktor Yanukovych, and then was president. He was known for, stealing money and corruption from the Ukrainian government. That leads to what they call the Orange Revolution, and people are tired of the oligarchs and the elites in politics stealing money from the state of Ukraine. Poroshenko is part of that movement, and the people who are involved in that movement say they no longer want the rich people of Ukraine to be involved in politics. So Poroshenko, being that he owns this chocolate factory, a well-known brand throughout Eastern Europe called Roshan. If you've never had it, they're really delicious. You might be able to find it in West Sac and some of the small Russian grocers over there. In any case, he decides to hide his assets because he doesn't want them to, appear to be part of the wealthy and elite during the Orange Revolution. So what he does is he takes all of his assets from Roshan and other holdings, and he sticks them in a shell company called Prime Asset Partners that's out there. And he does this during 2014, and it's basically a holding company out there. And he says he's doing this to get prepared to sell these assets off so that he won't be one of those richest people, and he'll be like one of the common folk in the Orange Revolution. Of course, he never does this, okay? And in fact, while he's setting these assets up in this holding company called Prime Asset Partners that's held offshore, that's the same time that the war with Russia is taking place in 2014, or at least pro-Russian forces within Ukraine. It's kind of a splintering or a split off, a small kind of civil war within Ukraine that's going on at that point in time. So in this case, you have a situation where these holding companies that exist offshore really give cover, political cover, to a man like Petro Poroshenko, who normally wouldn't be elected, given the anger of the people during the Orange Revolution. Well, the assets are allowed to be, have the appearance that they're being stored offshore, and so then Poroshenko can say, well, I'm not one of these elites. All my assets, I have divested myself of all my assets, okay? Which, of course, in the end turns out to be untrue, and when he becomes prime minister, he's just as crooked as everybody else. The thing that's kind of interesting here is you see this is a statistic that's mentioned in the Panama Papers, but I think is a kind of staggering one. And it says that 80% of Ukraine's 48 million people live below the poverty line. 80% of people in Ukraine live in poverty. If you've met the great number of Ukrainians who live in Sacramento, who've come here as emigres, you know that that there's quite a few of them, and one of the reasons is because of the fact that you just couldn't get ahead in a country like Ukraine because the wealthy own everything, and 80% of people are living at the poverty level. Right? So they come to the States to escape all of that. But imagine that instead of using the wealth that they get through corruption and bribes, and essentially just taking money and from the state and hiding it offshore, that the money was actually going in to facilitate and develop the economy, to help that 80% of the population in Ukraine get out of poverty and provide social programs, help, opportunity, etc., etc. I think you could probably say that one of the main effects of this story is that through all that corruption, the hiding of wealth offshore, it ensures that Ukraine stays a desperately poor nation. And you see this in a lot of the places where corruption takes place, particularly in Africa, right, where a lot of the wealth is siphoned off to the very rich. That goes offshore, and privately they become wealthy, while the rest of the country suffers because they don't have access to health care, education, etc. And all you need to do to show this is to illustrate how in these countries, healthcare programs, education programs, etc., retirement programs are either non-existent or they're dramatically underfunded. And oftentimes you can go to illustrate that fairly quickly and fairly easily because it's well documented. Okay, so those are two stories that come to us from the Panama Papers that I hope you will potentially examine. There's so many more within the book, outside the book. What I find is people read this book and they start to pay attention to the news. They probably hear once a week a story that involves the global shadow banking system and shell companies and how money is moved in and out of these companies to hide illegal or ill-gotten gains. And if you've heard one of those stories, that may be something you can work up and talk about within your paper, and find something out about the world that you didn't know about before. Well, that's it, and we will see you next time. And until then, happy hunting and happy researching.